Welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is working at McDonald's a form of slavery? In a free society, would low-wage jobs exist? If so, are low-wage jobs a form of slavery that ought to be abolished? Tim.
Before we start about whether slavery, what exactly is wage slavery, I think we should define slavery. So Walter Block's definition here is slavery is you can't run away. And why is slavery wrong? Well, of course, it violates the NAP. And Robert Nozick, by the way, doesn't even, in Anarchy and Utopia, doesn't even bother saying slavery. Like, what right-thinking person is in favor of slavery? So we just sort of assume that slavery is wrong. Marx doesn't really provide any per se moral argument why slavery is wrong. So in that regard, to the critics of the NAP, we just assume it's wrong. So what is slavery? Well, slavery is taking someone's labor. It also violates the freedom of association. That's how Walter Block describes. He had this sort of spat with the New York Times. You can't keep the fruits of your labor. You can be bought or sold to another slaveholder. These are some of the attributes of slavery. Walter Block says that slavery is not singing songs and picking cotton. You can pick cotton, you can sing songs, but it's you don't have access to your fruits of your labor, and you don't have access to anything like sovereignty over where you want to do what you want to do. Okay, but I'm going to bring up Hans Hoppe before we continue any more on that point of what Walter Block. I'd say Hoppe, Block, and of course Marx all would mostly agree to that definition or certain aspects of definition. But I think Hoppe, in his great essay/lecture on Austrian class analysis and its similarities with Marxism, this is from the 80s, this lecture, but it's a real gem, points out that the Marxists are sort of engaged in a trick. The genuinely new Marxist idea that is that essentially nothing is changed as regards exploitation under capitalism, i.e. the slave becomes a free labor, or if the peasants decide to farm land homesteaded by someone else and pays rent in exchange for doing so. To be sure, Marx is in the famous gives a volume of Capital. He goes through how British peasants were expropriated their land. But even if this didn't happen, even if the land they got, even if this sort of brutal expropriation happened, and Hoppe says that it's probably broadly true, and to some extent it is broadly true. The peasants were free peasants, and this is in chapter 27, Das Kapital, and they were enclosed, they were rounded up, it was divided amongst the barons, so to speak, and that's how they were forced into the cities, and that's how you got them as wage slaves. But even if that isn't true, this is based on the factor prices. The wages paid to laborers by the capitalists are lower than the output prices, and this is related to labor theory of value. And this is all technical economics. I think technical economics is important. It's interesting, Hoppe, Marx, and the classical liberals all believe that classical chattel slavery, existing like in the American South or in certain European third world empires, as well as the Ottomans did it to whites and the Eastern Europeans too, is clearly slavery and is clearly inefficient. So there's no disagreement there. Serfdom, you have more rights under serfdom. This exists in Eastern Europe. And in Britain up until like the 1400s or 1500s, although that's complicated because, some of the Marxists almost seem to infer that life was better under serfdom than it was under, air quote, early capitalist wage slavery. But the Marxists and the Austrians agree that, slavery and those two things are slavery. What slavery and serfdom? Interesting, serfdom ends up looking a lot like taxation. Because you have to work the master's land, or a certain number of your households has to spend a certain amount of time working the master's land before the land is letted out. Of course, you can't be bought and sold. You have to keep your families together. But in that regard, there's more rights you have. But this comes into the new question today, which is wage slavery? I use slavery in air quotes. Is a free laborer working for some modern corporation no different, as Marx would argue, than the serf or the slave in terms of production? And this to me is an interesting insight. You see this, Keith Preston will point out that he views McDonald's as a sweatshop. He views working at Walmart as like a neo-feudalism. It shows up on the social democratic left, of course, as well. So in technical economics realms, what would be the contents to make the left think that wage slavery isn't slavery? I think the answer is nothing could demonstrate that, because they would think that under no circumstances would people choose to work for this. Now, the Hoppe points out the capitalists, based on time preference, if the capitalist was really an exploitative relationship with them, would want to hire more workers. But the capitalist is a consumer too, so that's why the capitalist doesn't want to employ infinite number of workers, because there are costs to employ. So he has to consume himself, and then they get, based on time preference, the workers. That's how the technical economics things. I think technical economics is important, but I think there's also two other factors that define slavery. Before I pass it over to Swithin to sort of I'm outlining my position, I want to hear what Swithin has to say, is cultural and pay. If you paid the workers at Walmart more money, would they suddenly become non-wage slaves? That's unclear. Interestingly, if you pay people more for doing a job, you might make the job more prestigious, or you might get more people wanting to do the job. That's one outcome of paying them more. One of the things I noticed in movies about slavery in the American South is they never show the slaves doing jobs that they would get paid for. Because some slaves, and also serfs throughout the classic European serfdom, would do jobs on other masters for land, and they actually would purchase their own freedom. How could they do that if the slave owner held all of their fruits of their labor, so to speak? So in that regard, taxation, it's sort of a form of taxation. That's actually an area where the Austrians are more pure than the Marxists. The Austrians view taxation as theft and slavery. I think it's perfectly correct to view so. From my understanding, and this is I get this from YouTuber Todd Lewis, is that early Roman republics, the patricians wouldn't pay any taxes. They might have to do military service, but they wouldn't pay any taxes. So in that regard, they were not enslaved by the state. And actually, the Randians have the same view on taxation. And of course, the social democrats like Ben Burgess have a sort of pro-taxation mindset. Of course, they would only want to tax the rich, but it never seems to work out that way. So those are sort of the technical economics. Would paying them more alleviate this problem? And I think the final aspect is cultural, dignity. And we're going to get into all these topics in more in depth, but I'm just sort of outlining them. And the cultural part is the job a good job? Again, back to American culture's view on American South slavery. Again, in the movies, they always show the brutal aspects. This goes back to Walter Block's thing about picking cotton or coal mining, which is a form of which coal mining is a pretty brutal job. I was listening to environmentalists, and he was saying that no one would freely choose to do coal mining under free conditions. That may or may not be true. If you paid them more, they might do it. Maybe bootlegging, but if you paid them more, they might do it. Which goes back to sort of the theory of how you got, the wages of so to speak. So dignity matters too. Is the job dignified? Very few people think, yeoman carpenters are wage slaves. Very few people who think that. Well, yeoman carpenters wouldn't be by definition. But, certain jobs, you work for them, they have prestige. People don't view them as slavery. So I think dignity matters too. They view this sort of Baroque, the brutal jobs as that. So with it, I've outlined some technical economics and some cultural part, and as well as the dignified. So that goes into what is and isn't slavery. So what do you make first within over the technical aspects of slavery and Hoppe's point about price time preference? And what do you agree with and what do you disagree with?
So I would agree with Hoppe that the capitalist relation with his worker is not ipso facto exploitative on the basis that the capitalist pays his employee less than the product of his labor, inverted commas, insofar as he earns interest. But I mean that's clearly true. Now, of course, you can make the case that interest is exploitative in and of itself. But there's another point really just in general with the Marxist position, which is the very fact that the capitalist earns profits is indicative of exploitation, because if he earned profits, and that is above the rate of of interest, that is, as well, is that, well, this clearly would then mean that they were not paying the full value of the socially necessary labour time for the worker, and so would therefore be exploited. Which there's a lot to go there in the Marxist position, but the fact that a capitalist makes a profit doesn't imply per se that they are being exploited. It's more of a case that, well, other firms have not actually, and other capitalists haven't put enough resources into that area so that the ones who do put it there and put it where consumers won't actually make profits. Because really, pure economic profits exist where there's not enough resources being devoted to that area, and you make losses where there's too many. I mean, that's the primary purpose. And exactly correct. The employee of the capitalist, if he didn't like it, he'd in principle go elsewhere. And so it's, he can leave to some extent. Now, that said, does that worker have as many options as he may otherwise do in a free society, which would improve his bargaining position? Well, no. And this gets an interesting question of when you are a slave, to whom are you a slave? And I think one of the problems with the left is that effectively they think that people are slaves of nature, and this is bad, and it is in a sense bad, but they kind of don't reckon that sort of scarcity is actually fundamentally a problem. It's just caused by other humans who have made things scarce, which is demonstrably false. So, for example, if you were in an island community of a free society, pretty industrial, well, in a sense, you are a slave to nature because you can't control the environment in which you operate very well, because you have no sort of like industrialized or post-industrial machinery or anything like that. And so you're at the whim of nature, and your sort of material standard of living is going to be low. On the other hand, though, you can clearly make a case that there is you are a sort of a slave of a person as such, which is sort of the classical chattel view. I own you, for example. But in that sense, can you have kind of, as it were, partial slavery? Well, clearly yes. Taxation is a form of it. Regulations of various descriptions, licensing requirements. Basically anything which the state imposes which increases barriers to entry over and above what would be voluntarily agreed to in the marketplace, increases costs of entry, which reduces the number of options for labourers to take, and therefore can in a sense be exploited by the state or by people within the current economic environment, because the legal framework gives them, as it were, an artificial advantage in bargaining position, which can then reduce the pay and conditions of the workers they employ. All that said, though, when it comes to slavery as well, I think you're exactly right with dignity, which we'll get onto later as to what that actually is. But I do think that, as you point out, is one crucial element to it. The idea, I think, as well with wage slavery is you're doing very mundane jobs over which you have little control or autonomy, and as well you're almost turned into a piece of machinery in a low wage job. That's interestingly the argument really of Metropolis, the Fritz Lang film from the 1920s, which is effectively a Marxist film, and that's the idea there, is that the workers are acting in such a way that they look like they are sort of like pistons and things, and they are sort of part of the machine. So yes, I do think you could argue that low wage jobs to something is a partial form of slavery, but of course it's a continuum.
the continuum point is clearly true. This is one of the bugaboos of analysis in general. So I think at the bottom you have chattel slavery, and at the top you have where you own capital and you have good bargaining power. Interestingly, I would say that, and this is where the Hoppians are correct in their class analysis, that the person who owns the most power is probably the state or state employees with private wealth. That would probably be a two-fang thing. Those persons are actually the top of the pyramid. And this is where the Marxists and some of the classical anarchists are probably the classical anarchists are much better than the Marxists. And in principle, the Marxists historically just became, and this Orwell's amazing in Animal Farm pointing this out, how they just sort of take over and they run the factories even more brutally than they did in a more exploitive and more alienative way than they did. So I do think it's a continuum problem. And this also goes back to Hoppe, because Hoppe oftentimes gets criticized for his argument about preferring to be a private slave over a public slave, saying that he'd rather be a serf of a monarch. And even Sean Gabb has a related point in defense of landed aristocracy. So that's another point that needs to be brought up here, is that to clear some of the air here, like how these people come up with these arguments and why I think they make sense to some extent. And this is based on, again, time preference. If you own the workers, you might treat them better if you're only a rental. Whether or not that's true or not historically is of some question. But again, this is a continuum problem. And I think it's quite clear at the bottom would be chattel slave. Although Hans Hoppe might argue that the bottom would be maybe not far off, would be working as a low-wage laborer for the Soviet Union, although that's unclear. Okay, so I think that's the first aspect. Now I want to get into pay, because this is the thing that's often brought up here. It's they're paid low and they need to be fight for 20 or fight for 15 or fight for higher wages. What complicates this factor is the money. Is the money that they're getting paid in is state money, which is constantly being inflated, which means the purchasing power is going down. So maybe in order to maintain wages, you need to keep constantly rising them, because the state keeps inflating them, which causes consumer price inflation. So I think I got that model basically correct. But nonetheless, if you paid them more, if you paid the workers more, and this comes up with Richard Wolfers, if you paid the steel workers more instead of paying the owner more, would that alleviate? That's part of, like, if McDonald's workers got paid more, would they suddenly be better off? Well, I think one part that needs to be bring in is being a McDonald's worker is an easy job. It's easy in the sense that it doesn't require it's. Now, people like Matt Brunig are all get annoyed at, and some of the Christian lefties would get annoyed at me by pointing out that it's actually harder than it looks. And in a way, it's harder than it looks, but in a way, no one really thinks that, if you look at high-wage jobs, there's generally a large correlation between that and skill. And typically, low-wage jobs are also low-skill jobs. It's not a perfect correlation, but it is largely true. So no one really thinks a person who's working at a nuclear power plant is a less skilled job than flipping hamburgers. But in general, the low-wage jobs are the kind of boring, mundane jobs, the Amazon pickers as well, so forth. So if you paid them $100,000 a year, would they suddenly become non-wage slaves? Well, that would be an interesting thought example. This is where I think the left in general has a sort of reality problem, as David Friedman would argue. First of all, if you paid people $100,000 to flip hamburgers, many people would just drop out of school and just flip hamburgers and get paid $100,000. That would be what they would do. It would have so one of the reasons why these jobs are paid low based on supply and demand is there's not there. It has to match the supply of people that want to do it versus demand. And actually, this is one of the arguments of raising wages in this coronavirus pandemic, because employers, people are so scared. Some amount of people are still scared, whether they're faking it or not is some question. So they have to sort of convince them to come out. So restaurants have to pay higher wages. But this would just mean there's fewer restaurants, because people don't have, the cost of going to a restaurant would go up, which then goes back into sort of broader topics of like, what kind of society one lives in. So then I've made some comments here regarding pay. People talk about the Amazon pickers. One of the reasons Amazon has a dominant position, arguably, in the market, let's just pick on Amazon here, is that it delivers the shipping very cheaply. And I think it could not do that without paying its workers as little as possible. And as much as, and this is where people tend to vote with their wallets and their feet, people choose to buy their stuff shipped by Amazon. And there are similar companies, Walmart, the companies that are cheap. They don't choose to buy at the living wages. And particularly, the sort of professional class that oftentimes does that. They buy from the cheap. So we done an episode on third worldism, interestingly enough. But nonetheless, this would mean that goods might cost more, and they couldn't buy as many goods if you were to pay. That would be the end result of paying them, in my book. Do you agree largely with that analysis? And do you have anything to add to that about paying more? Would that solve it for the Marxists if it met the profits?
If you paid them more, would you be able to? Would it change the current economic arrangement? Well, certainly. I mean, could Amazon function with pickers being paid more? Probably not. At least they wouldn't be nearly as popular if they did. But then, of course, when you come to McDonald's, McDonald's as well, Amazon, you then have the infrastructure subsidy arguments of Kevin Carson, etc., etc. So as to what it would look like is, if you were to get rid of the subsidies, direct or indirect, is less than straightforward. But you're certainly right. I mean, just paying people more is going to cause, if you were to do it like a minimum wages in industries, for example, it would cause a radical alteration of the types of jobs that existed. The number of people in sort of the restaurant industry would be much lower, etc., etc. And that's certainly true. When it comes to pay, I think that's interesting. I don't. So let's assume away the interrelated problems, and let's suppose we could pay the McDonald's worker more money. Let's suppose we paid the McDonald's worker £20 an hour. Would that cease to be wage slavery? Well, in a way, he would be able to earn more, which means his standard of living would be higher. Now, but would he really have I think one of this is a sense of the Marxist idea of like alienation. Yeah. Would this worker still be alienated from his labor, even if he was paid more? And I think, well, probably to some extent. Because I think, at least when it comes to dignity, there's a few aspects I think that are important. Firstly, I think to have a dignified job, and this is why the yeoman carpenter, I think, is not considered a slave, is because he has a lot of control over the type of work that he does. You have a lot of autonomy. I think that's one aspect of not being a wage slave. Another is that probably related to the level of autonomy, although not necessarily, it's a job that people hold in high social esteem, in high esteem. So, for example, like teachers, if they're not being paid very much, and even if they just have to teach the curriculum, they are considered, rightly or wrongly, useful socially and have high social status to some extent. And so then that job is somewhat dignified. I think as well with dignity, I suppose if you don't have much control of it, but you kind of like doing it, in a sense you're not really alienated from it, and therefore you see it having some form of intrinsic worth, and so that gives it some form of dignity. Now, obviously, money helps as well, and that's probably related to the to the social standing that job has. But just by paying people more, you wouldn't solve any of these things. I suppose you could say paying men more would help with dignity, insofar as the young male working at McDonald's is going to be significantly more marriageable now that he is paid a much higher salary, which simply doesn't matter to the same extent with female employees, because basically men will marry any woman who they like, and an income doesn't matter nearly to the same extent. But those are I would say the factors with respect to dignity, autonomy, social standing of the job, and to what extent you actually enjoy doing it.
The status argument is interesting, to say the least. This is where the managerial class, so to speak, and the middle class left, liberal class left, have a kind of snobbery to working class jobs, which also shows up in the education system and the sort of disdain for tech education with respect to college education. They sort of poo-poo people becoming electricians and carpenters and garbage men, even though arguably they make more than adjunct professors. So in this regard, I'm somewhat of a I'm somewhat of a salt of the earth type, in the sense that if I'm gonna crash on a deserted island, the last person I want is a college professor. I mean, I'll take the carpenter. I'll take the electrician would be difficult, but the electrician probably has useful skills like hand-eye coordination and things like that, and strength, and things like that. So the sort of working class type, traditional working class jobs, the disdain for them is rather interesting. And Keith Preston brought this up once, that he would organize university students to try to help at the IWW, and these sort of tough older guys, and they were calling Mexicans and African Americans all sorts of slurs, and the students were sort of horrified at that. So this to some extent mirrors my own experience at low wage jobs as well. It's sort of I have a little bit of experience in that. But yeah, the paying them is clearly a case of the status going up or down. And the left in the developed world does have a sort of, I'd argue actually a triple standard here. In some ways it fetishizes them, in some ways it doesn't. Interestingly, one of the differences between the historical, what Marx would call proletariat, and the current underclass is the historical proletariat worked very hard. You could see that with coal mines, you could see that with the serfs, you could see that with all sorts of people. They had to work very hard. The current underclass in the United States, and this to some extent explains the taxation part, and this is where we can actually bring in Ayn Rand somewhat. The current underclass in the United States has an unemployment problem or underemployment problem, not being worked too hard. Of course, they could sign up for a job and work very hard at a low wage, but there's a sort of degree in which they don't have to, because we're a much wealthier society. We do have some form of welfare state, informal and informal, even in the United States. There's Medicare, there's disability insurance, there's all sorts of things, and there's so the historical proletariat worked what Marx was describing in the 1800s. They worked like dogs. Like certain railroads, if you lost your hand in one of these switches, they would just fire you. Because you're no longer useful to them. Those kind of practices are very much long gone. Although Amazon, to some extent, Amazon might be the closest doing that. People get carpal tunnel from the picking. So paying them more or offering them more benefits might alleviate certain aspects of that. But the dignity question, I think, is still central here, and what exactly makes a wage slave and what doesn't make a wage slave. Because, for example, many journalists at newspapers don't get paid very much, but people do not view that as wage slaves. Many adjunct professors don't get paid very much. Do people view them as wage slaves? Would the professors? Well, the professors at times might view them, but and this also is that a hobby for them? A hobby. This also shows up in people who own very small businesses that don't make much money, that just live at subsistence. I don't view those people who own small businesses at subsistence as wage slaves. I don't view college professors who choose to be college professors and make 20 grand a year as wage slaves. Although by technical economic means, I clearly I think they are. If you, for example, own a bike shop, that's a very notoriously low margin industry. I mean, you barely make it along. Many of these places, actually, they did quite well. Or a similar industry like that. That's a hobby. And again, this is where the Marxist labor theory of value starts falling apart, because it seems to fetishize labor, and it sort of in a way it hyper fetishizes labor in a way which the capitalist doesn't. I mean, the capitalist has no problem with labor saving devices. The Luddites do. The Luddites have much more problem with getting rid of capitalist labor-saving devices that come in. And that was one of the things that ignited the Pittsburgh Railroad strike, which is a major strike that occurred with respect to the Pennsylvania Railroad. They wanted to modernize their locomotives, which would lead to cuts. And actually, one of the reasons why diesels were phased out, one of the reasons why there was hesitancy to phase out steam engines was that diesels wouldn't exactly create all these jobs that steam engines were very labor intensive, diesels were less labor intensive, and the phasing out of them was a problem because they had to lay off a large amount of the workforce. So I do think the Marxists at times, when it comes to dignity and those sort of brutal jobs, want it sort of both ways. They want to say they're brutal jobs that should be abolished. But then again, they also turn around and say they should do something else. And then the problem with doing something else is there isn't always an easy industry for them to go right back into or do something like that. We see this showed up with the American South after the Civil War, where they have all these ex-slaves. They just became sharecroppers right after it. So now, which, if you take the Marxist analysis and the Hoppian analysis, you start coming up with weird conclusions that that caused downward pressure on northern factory workers. Which is actually how you got the minimum wage here in the United States, which is the very politically incorrect history of the minimum wage here in the United States. But I do think what goes into wage slavery has to hinge on dignity, because the adjunct professor or the small shop owner who might make less money than the McDonald's employee after expenses, because if you calculate some of these very small businesses, arguably there's some sub shops where I doubt the owners makes more than $4 an hour if he took his expenses and his costs seriously. But that person enjoys running a small pizza restaurant. He enjoys it enough that he does. Now the Matt Brunig problem is those jobs don't pay as much. Those small, boutique bourgeois type jobs don't pay as much. So are they enslaving themselves? I think by Marxist logic, they are. So then what do you make of my sort of, I've been ranting a little bit about here, but there seems to be a fetishization and wanting it both ways when it comes to labor with respect to the Marxist left that I don't think is the case with the capitalist right. Swithin?
Well, you are right with the fetishization of labor, because it all comes down to the labor theory of value. You have the salt of the earth proletarian workers who put in the socially necessary labor time to produce consumer goods, and they have a terrible drudgery of a job, but they put lots of effort in and of the socially necessary type, and so if they were paid the full fruits of their labor, then they would be paid a great amount. But yeah, and you're exactly right, as I alluded to earlier. A key aspect of the wage slave argument is really, I think, to a large extent comes down to autonomy. I think the fact that you can work for this mega corporation over which you have very little control basically means you're a slave. And I suppose you could then, if you extended this argument, you could make an argument that those people who work in relatively high-paid jobs in corporations are effectively a slave to the corporation, which is not something anybody typically talks about, because you probably have relatively high social status, but your activities are relatively circumscribed. Although I suppose you could argue the same is true of journalists. But I do think one of the key aspects is the autonomy one, because to be a slave of somebody else, you have to do what they tell you. Now, you could, of course, argue that in the free society or in Ancapistan, the business owner is a slave of the customer. But as Rothbard pointed out in Man, Economy, and State, that's untrue, because if the business owner doesn't want to do what the customer wants, then no trade takes place. That's why Rothbard objects to the concept of consumer sovereignty. He rather argues it should be individual sovereignty instead, which I think is accurate. So when it comes to pay, etc., it's it can't just be pay. And I think the issue, I think, with the left when it comes to dignity of working class kind of jobs is that I think they have the idea that eventually you could get, practically speaking, or in the near future, get rid of the icky jobs that the icky people do. And then if you gave them sort of more dignified work, then they would become less icky and make less Mexican jokes. And I think it's sort of like the fundamental egalitarianism of the left actually breeds this sort of snobbishness when it comes to, as it were, the lower classes. Whereas the right typically don't care about that. They go, well, yeah, there's people on the top and people on the bottom, but the people on the bottom are still people. They're still providing useful social function. Yeah, of course. They aren't at the same standing as the upper class, but you've got noblesse oblige. You've got the rich have obligations to the poor, to treat them well or to give alms in the time of need. But the sort of strictly sort of meritocratic view of the left to a large extent, meritocratic and sort of egalitarian insofar as everyone can become a upper middle class media type in their sort of lifestyle and income and social standing. Then when everyone's not there, then that's kind of a problem, which I think explains to a large extent the snobbishness. So I think in this society, I think you always have lower paid jobs, and I think some people will just like working for somebody else and being told what to do. I think that's certainly true. Now, how will these people ever get dignity and be not considered a wage slave? I think to a large extent it comes down to the upper and middle classes recognizing that, well, you're actually doing a job that has value. Now, I think that would increase probably anyway in a free society, because a lot of jobs that currently exist, you think, why on earth do you do that, is largely due to state intervention and regulation, etc. Why? I mean, all these ridiculous sort of like legal compliance jobs, for one thing. I mean, there's no real sort of. It's just, well, that's a bit of a waste of a time of a job. Well, yeah, of course it is, but you just got to do it to tick all the boxes to keep the government off your back. So I do think there'd be more obvious value in jobs in a free society. But I think you're still going to recognize that there's always going to be some jobs that are going to have more dignity and less. But I think the main thing is going to be the elite to actually recognize the lower class as, whilst being lower class, are still not negative and therefore are worthy of some forms of respect.
The irony here is how the supposed egalitarians are the ones that end up with the snobbish position, and the supposed inegalitarians are the ones that end up with the functionally less snobbish position, where more people are valued than less people valued. I think this just gets into the position that dignity in a certain sense, the capitalist hand still to some extent illuminate. I would say capitalism hasn't succeeded far enough in my opinion, because then if we had a more perfect capitalist society, we would have the and this sometimes is a horror show for the this is sometimes a horror show for the left, but having jobs that pay well are the jobs that are viewed by society as valuable. So this oftentimes shows up with like the feminism debate, for example. But I actually think the fact that they're paid low is actually at times an explanation that they are valuable, but that everyone can do them. So you get these sort of weird dilemmas where women leave the home to work for a corporation to pay $100,000, but they're going to have a nanny raise their children. So that's a kind of a strange view. Now, for example, both my grandmothers worked, but one of them worked because they needed to. They worked because they needed to in that regard. Well, maybe by some sort of super like utilitarian primitivist position, they didn't really need to. But there is a certain degree in which become weird. The modern world is increasingly come up with weird twists where people find working for large corporations to be almost emancipatory, and working at home or working for yourself as to be unemancipatory. That is one of the most strangest things that exists in the modern world here, with these sort of obsession with wages, which is actually one of the reasons I think why Ancapistan actually aligns more of human nature here. And Thaddeus Russell made an interesting argument in his book Renegades of History, which is called The Freedom of Slavery, where he argued that with respect to the work aspect, unlike the owners and unlike the upper class, the managerial class, the slaves of the system are actually quite free. So they're actually quite free in what they get to do in their free time. So they work, but once they're out, or even when they're working, they don't have to pay attention much. They're doing a very boring job. The person that's making $100,000 is doing a harder job that requires more focus. Those lower paid jobs, you can just sort of goof off and so forth. There's less more opportunities to shirk and more opportunities to that. So Thaddeus Russell comes up with the conclusion that the slaves are actually, in a way, more free. And that's how Thaddeus Russell says that jazz music develops. So this is another area of jazz music, which then creates rock and roll, which creates the counterculture. This is another area where the left wants it both ways. They want the benefits of slavery, but that they don't want the costs. They want the costs, the benefits of freedom, but they don't want the cost. This goes back to the slave of nature thing here, not a slave of another person, unless you think that society is a kind of person. But I would argue society exists, and this is comes up with Hoppy's short history of society. The division of labor exists to increase humans' flourishing, unless of course you're a primitivist. Then you think civilization is a kind of curse, which may or may not be true. But then again, the left generally views itself as a hyper progressive, not a primitive force. With that respect, what do you make of the argument that slaves are in a way more free? I mean, this is one of the best arguments of why you become a wage slave. It's a sort of easy job. It's easy with respect to the mental aspect. It's monotonous, possibly. It's easy to do. It doesn't require much education. It doesn't require much skill. It doesn't, and to get those jobs that pay more, that requires more of that. So then what do you make of that? And as well as what do you make of with the strange, because you almost end up the view, and some early feminists have this, of like women being exploited by stay-at-home parents. So I made two comments there. What do you make of them?
Well, when it comes to our low-paid, our slaves the freest in society, well, in a sense, well, I suppose it would depend to some extent on your cognitive ability. But to do a low-paid job, which is easy, means that you can work, and if you can pay your bills, then you can do what you want. I remember coming across a guy who he just worked easy jobs, and he paid. I suppose he got to like management level of like a Pizza Hut or something, and he didn't particularly want to go particularly high. He just wanted an easy money, and then he could just do what he wanted. He could play games, he could read, You can do what you want, and when you get jobs typically of higher social standing or whatever, you're going to sacrifice income for time. I mean, this is one way you could argue that like very rich people, entrepreneurs and things, are sort of slaves of their own companies. I mean, when a lot of the entrepreneurs who are millionaires, they work ridiculous days. They work like 14-hour days regularly, like every day. And it's like, well, wouldn't you like just to earn less and like do more fun stuff? So yeah, certainly in a way that's true, and especially as well with low-paid jobs. If you could just get by, then you don't need to go and train or go to a trade school or whatever. You just get out of school, hopefully as early as possible, work, and then you set up and you can do whatever you pretty much want to for the rest of your life. So I think that's true. Onto the feminism point, I mean, it's utterly bizarre, is the feminist view of things. Well, it isn't entirely. I mean, there are some women who are basically more masculinized and would rather seek status from activities in the external world, in business, in technology or whatever. And I think to a large extent, although I haven't done any extensive research on this, I suspect this is where a lot of the original feminist movements comes from, because they wanted to do something different and didn't want to be sort of under the thumb of their husband. But most women don't tend to want to go that high or to earn that much. I mean, I'm pretty sure the data is that if a woman earns more than her husband, like the probability of divorce is really high. Or it's significantly higher than if the husband earns more than the wife. It's not something that they either want in most cases or will do well if they have it. And for those women who are, more traditionally minded, and by traditionally minded, I don't mean as in like conservative traditional, but insofar as, they like people, they like children, they like doing things with their family. Those women, why be sort of, as it were, a slave of a corporation would be a slave of your husband? I mean, I'm pretty sure you're going to have more bargaining power over your husband than you are of a mega corporation when it comes to your line of employment. So that's sort of like an utterly bizarre position to take.
The bizarreness of that position is apparent, and this goes back into the if Marx has an argument how we got here, how they got the original capitalists. This poses problems with if you really look at who fills a lot of these, what the left likes to call retail wage slavery. Because the truck drivers and those jobs pay a lot more. The welders, those sort of higher end Votech jobs, they're almost now like the oil riggers, the drillers, and the frackers. Those people get paid well, so it's a lot harder to say they're wage slaves. But look at the sort of retail, they tend to be women, interestingly. I don't know the exact numbers for each society, but from the tendency is them to be women increasingly. Actually, in this, what the proverbial satanic mills of the industrial age, that was the case as well. So there is an interesting relationship here between gender politics and wage slave, which oftentimes goes missed by the left, which is one of the things I wanted to bring up here at the end here, because going back to what is a dignified job and what isn't a dignified job, with the obsession with the Marxists end up having a weird obsession with having a high-paying job, basically. Matt Brunig basically wrote an article for Jacobin, basically arguing that why work for a low-paying job when you can work for a high-paying job. Now, I agree. Ayn Rand for the win at times. If you want to make more money, go make more money. But this goes back to values. Like what exactly do you value? Is the only value of their money there? So again, no, none. I don't think we have actual slavery where we're selling and buying. Maybe in Libya we do. Thanks, Hillary Clinton. But here in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, that kind of slavery doesn't exist. So in that regard, I don't think wage slavery, working at McDonald's or someplace like that for $7 an hour, is slavery. But I think on another level, it is the case. But the way we got there is rather complicated, and the motives we do is rather complicated. And I sort of wanted to get. I'm fairly happy with how we sort of laid this out. As an individual, I don't condone anyone who does it. I think it's actually a good thing. I don't know if I would defend the sweatshops there. I wouldn't know if I'd go full Yaron Brooks here, but I also don't think I would go full Keith Preston and say that they are slaves, wage slaves, or full Kevin Carson. So what do you make of those final 2 points, Swith and I've made about the actual, how we got here? Do you broadly agree with that sort of interesting side history, and as well as the sort of 2 later points about, what we have to make of people making these choices here to go do that? I mean, my personal view is that in some ways there is a inegalitarian, and some people just going to make bad choices. I don't know what I as an individual can change that. But those are my sort of thoughts there. Swithin?
Well, when it comes to sweatshops, would I sort of support sweatshops? Well, I suppose my general view is that, well, they aren't ideal, far from it. But given the situation in which they're operating, it seems to be the least bad alternative. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've heard of people like illegally emigrating into places like I think like Cambodia to work in sweatshops in Thailand because it pays way more than they do in the field, which is probably true. But that then the question is, well, why can you earn so little in the field? Well, clearly it could be like a lack of capital, or it could be historic land theft as well, and all the best land is appropriated by other people, which is entirely possible. So to your second point, yes, the left really have got a lot to answer for when it comes to wage slavery of women in particular. It possibly comes from the materialism of Marx and the general sort of anti-family positions that he held. But today, the only sort of value that is sort of supplied culturally is in the marketplace, and you have to be part of a corporation or a firm to be employed. You can't be, as it were, employed by your husband. That's demeaning. But being employed by a corporation is good. Now, I do think being more home focused has significantly less social standing it did historically. But I do think when it comes to dignity in general, I do think it's a bigger problem for men than for women, because if a woman becomes pregnant and then raises a child, well, okay, you might think, well, you should give it to a nanny and pay someone to do it, and you should go and work for Walmart. But that generally has at least some social standing. It's going to have more social standing than the man who ends up working as a sewer diver. Those exist. In India are particularly unpleasant. The preparation for becoming a sewer diver every day is normally drinking lots of whiskey. And so dignity in action, I think, is a much more male requirement. But men actually have to go and do something and be considered socially valuable, whereas women don't tend to need to do that as much. I mean, you can make some evolutionary biology arguments on that basis. But that said, that they are sort of pushed into retail. I mean, just the whole hilarious thing about lockdowns. And coronavirus. It's like, oh no, more men may have died of coronavirus. Oh no, but women are picking up all the work. They're having to do how many shifts, I don't know, the feminists are talking about these days. Oh, they have to look after the children now. and they need to work at the same time, and all this sort of thing. And it's like, as ever with anything, if it looks like it's affecting men more badly than women, then the immediate thought is, let's try to interpret this as how it's oppressing women. But obviously, if the women weren't working outside the home to start with, then it wouldn't have been as much of a problem. And interestingly, like the whole school issue of lockdowns and things would be significantly less of a problem, and things, because well, the women would have been out of the workforce to mess up the current sort of structure of production, because they wouldn't have been there to begin with, or they'd been effectively employed by the husband. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's another question. But it at least highlights that difference, and it is weird. I talked number of years ago. I had a few female students who were in that sort of high end of high school in the American context, and they were just like complaining. I can't remember how it came up, that there was always like the women in STEM promotion every time: science, technology, engineering, and maths, because this is what they must do, because this is the serious stuff, and this is where you get value. And they were like, we don't care. We don't want to go into STEM. And I was like, yeah, that's what I expected. So it is bizarre, but again, it's oddly, again, in the same way that the left basically dislikes the poor, actually the left actually dislike women, because what women should do is try and do things in a traditionally male environment, and that's where value resides.
Which the male environment, as they say, is more exploitive. I mean, they'll complain about the conditions of Amazon. I mean,
but what they need to do is they need to climb up and get there and compete with the men and become on top and become. Well, interestingly, the highest paid CEO in England is head of a really big bastion of virtue of Bet365, and she was paid like a couple of years ago £265 million in a year as CEO of Bet365, because that's where women should be, the CEO of a betting company.
I bring these up not necessarily to score points, but to sort of highlight the general weirdness of how we got a lot of modern day wage slavery. And this goes back to, why does the restaurant sector exist? Well, people eat out more often. Why do people eat out more often? Well, that answer becomes quickly logical to answer once you sort of, I think the people listening to this could assume why that happens. So, eating out, that's a big reason why we eat out. We don't eat at home as much, for better or for worse. You might say this is a feature, but if you want people to eat out, you need to have people to employ there and do that. So, yeah, the weirdness of how we got to the modern day economy, the left has played a huge role in creating it. The cultural left. The economic left, that's largely resided in the Soviet Union, which actually has created this weird sort of reactionary society in Eastern Europe. Which, so in that regard, that's another strange outcome of the last, 150 years of intellectual and economic history since, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution here. I do think going forward there will be less wage slavery with or without coronavirus, thanks to inflation, which will make working less useful, and staying at home hopefully will be. I mean, this is where actually I think the high UBI ends up being a positive thing, culturally. Whether or not it's positively economically is some question. This goes back to the nature point, which is very key. I think this is the whole problem with the left. They don't really believe in actual scarcity, which is one of the reasons why people have to work, and particularly historically. Historically, there was much more scarcity. So going forward, I think there could be, thanks to technology, less work. But you have to stop fetishizing labor, and you have to stop fetishizing material values, which they're obsessed with material values. They're historical materialists. So this is subjective theory value for the win. So those are my overall comments on wage theory. I'm glad there are people that work for McDonald's. I wouldn't want to do it, but I don't really hold any snobbery against them. And I also do think if you think a job is exploitative, if you have to quit on your own volition, the Carthaginians, for example. Now this might be an extreme example. The Carthaginians male all killed themselves, and most of the women did too. Why? They didn't want to be slaves of the Romans. So if you really think wage slavery is slavery, then you got to quit and accept the punishment. There's a Marxist claim when the operation of the machine becomes so odious you have to make the machine stop. Then do it. Have your revolution and quit. But then again, people vote with their feet. By their feet, it seems like they enjoy it enough to keep doing it. But then again, who knows? Swithin, do you have any final comments? I've enjoyed this discussion very much.
Oh no, I agree entirely. What I would say with going forward, I suspect with the increase of home working and internet availability, I do think you're probably going to be able to get more sort of self-employment. And I think that's going to become slightly easier, which will reduce some sort of aspects of wage slavery. But when you say to McDonald's, I have no antipathy towards the people who work at McDonald's. I remember being in Atlanta. This wasn't McDonald's, Atlanta Airport, and it was the first time I went to what's the Christian fast food place called? That's always on Babylon Beach.
Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, Chick-fil-A. I was there, and I was served by a very polite young black man who was there, and I was like, oh, he's a nice guy, He's providing me a service, he's doing a good job. I wouldn't want to do it, but if he does it, he's getting paid and he can do stuff that he otherwise wouldn't do, then great. I was impressed. I liked it, it was good. And similarly, when I've taught some really stupid people in the past, but they were more pleasant and nicer to be around than some of the more intelligent ones who were somewhat unpleasant. And sort of almost sort of criminal in sort of like their conniving. But one of the guys who at a low end job, he'd do it. He'd turn up on time. He'd do what you wanted. And he'd go home. He would never be the sharpest tool in the box, but he could be useful and have a good life. And he'd be a good asset to society as a whole. So I do think what needs to be done when it comes to labour is to realise that not everybody can get to the top. Not even basically in principle, and that to recognise the use of people that do exist and what value they provide to society. I'd just like now to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and if you can, please subscribe to us on Podbean or on YouTube. We have recently gone beyond 100 subscribers on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can enjoy the show. And finally, if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.